Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The rain had started just as I pulled into the driveway, a fine, gray mist that blurred the lines of our suburban street, making the identical houses look like smudged drawings. And I sat in the car for a long time after the engine cut out, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the soft patter against the roof, my fingers still gripping the steering wheel as if I were suspended in midair. The hour in Dr. Evans's soothingly beige office clinging to me like a shroud, her final words, "Be gentle with yourself, Mark," echoing not as a comfort, but as a condemnation, a reminder of how much work there was still to do, an unscalable mountain of self-improvement that I was too tired to even look at. Alex was waiting for me inside, I knew, with a cup of tea that would be just the right temperature, with a concerned smile that didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. A smile that had become a careful, practiced expression over the last few months. A mask for the anxiety I knew was simmering beneath the surface, the anxiety my lack of progress caused him. He wanted a fixed partner, a whole man, and I kept presenting him with the same fractured pieces, session after session, and I could feel his hope thinning, becoming brittle. I finally forced myself out of the car, the damp air seeping through my jacket, and trudged up the path to our front door, each step a conscious effort, and inside, the warmth was a shock, the smell of lemon polish and something simmering on the stove a stark contrast to the sterile, abstracted world of therapy. And there was Alex, coming out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, his smile appearing right on cue. "Rough one?" he asked, his voice soft. And I just nodded, shrugging off my wet coat, unable to articulate the particular flavor of exhaustion that therapy induced, a deep bone weariness from the mental excavation of things I'd spent a lifetime burying. "I made stew," he said, and I followed him into the living room where the lights were dimmed, and the room was a haven of normalcy. But it felt like a stage set, every object, the framed photos of us smiling on a beach, the books on the shelf, the throw blanket neatly folded, seeming slightly false, props in a life I was no longer convincingly acting in. I sank into the corner of the sofa, pulling the blanket over me even though I wasn't cold, and Alex brought me the tea, sitting close but not touching, a careful inch of space between us that felt like a canyon. "She just keeps asking about my father," I heard myself say, the words tasting like ash. "Like if I can just perfectly recall the pattern of the linoleum on the kitchen floor the day he left. Then some cosmic lock will click open and I'll be healed." And Alex nodded, his brow furrowed in that familiar, earnest expression of trying to understand. But I could see the impatience in the tightness around his mouth. The unspoken question, why isn't this working? Later, after a dinner I mostly pushed around my bowl, the silence between us grew thick and heavy, and my eyes wandered to the top shelf of the bookcase, to the dusty corner where an old Ouija board box was tucked away, a relic from a Halloween party years ago, a joke we'd all laughed at, and I felt a bizarre, impulsive pull towards it, a childish desire for an answer that wasn't couched in clinical terms, for a voice that wasn't Dr. Evans's measured, probing tone or Alex's worried. Encouragement. "What about that thing?" I said, pointing, and Alex followed my gaze, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "The Ouija board? Seriously? Mark, that's not really a good idea, is it?" But his objection felt weak, perfunctory, and I think we were both so desperate for any kind of change, any new dynamic, that the idea took root in the stagnant air between us. "It's just a game," I said, more to convince myself than him, and I stood up, my body moving with a strange, detached purpose, and retrieved the box, blowing off a layer of dust that danced in the lamplight. The board itself was cheap cardboard, the letters and numbers printed in a faux archaic font, the sun and moon symbols in the corners looking cheerful rather than ominous, and the planchette was light plastic, a little heart-shaped window in its center. It was a toy, nothing more, and yet as we cleared the coffee table and set it down, the atmosphere in the room shifted, grew still and expectant. Alex lit a few candles, turning off the lamps, and the flickering light carved deep shadows into his face, making him look like a stranger, and we sat opposite each other on the floor, our knees almost touching, the board between us. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and the feeling was absurd at first, our hands stacked together, a clumsy pyramid, and I almost laughed, but then Alex said, "Should we ask something?" And his voice was a whisper, and the mood settled back into something grave. "Is anyone there?" I asked, the question feeling silly in my mouth. And for a long moment, nothing happened, just the sound of the rain outside and our own breathing, and then a tremor so slight I thought it was my own muscle twitch. But then it moved again, a slow, deliberate slide to the word yes. A jolt, part fear and part exhilaration, went through me, and I looked at Alex, whose eyes were wide, fixed on our hands. "Who are we speaking to?" I asked, and the planchette began to move, spelling out a name I didn't recognize, Martin, and I felt a slight disappointment, the anticlimax of contacting a random spirit. But then I asked, "What do you want?" And the movement changed, becoming faster, more assertive, sliding not to words but to letters that initially seemed random. Transference. I froze. The word was Dr. Evans's word, a term she had explained to me just that afternoon, the complex redirecting of feelings onto the therapist. "What does that mean?" I whispered, more to myself than to the board, and it spelled out unresolved, and then parental, and my blood ran cold. "This isn't funny, Alex," I said, my voice tight, but he shook his head, his face pale in the candlelight. "I'm not doing it, Mark, I swear." And his fingers felt limp under mine, and the planchette continued its eerie journey, now spelling out a phrase that made my heart stop. Repressed memory of father's departure. That was verbatim. She had said those exact words to me, in that order, today, in the quiet of her office, a hypothesis she was gently floating. My throat closed up. This was no longer a game. This was something else, something impossible. "How do you know that?" I demanded of the empty room, my voice cracking, and the planchette, with a will of its own, moved to the center of the board, to the word goodbye, and stopped dead. We pulled our hands back as if burned, and sat in stunned silence, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart against my ribs. Alex was staring at the board, his expression unreadable, a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't place. "You must have pushed it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I heard you talking about it when you got home. Your dad. It must have been in your subconscious." But the specificity of the language, the clinical phrasing, it wasn't my subconscious, it was hers. The following days were a haze of paranoia. I went back to my session with Dr. Evans, my nerves frayed, and I studied her face, her hands, the way she held her pen, searching for any sign, any flicker of otherworldly knowledge. I couldn't bring myself to mention the Ouija board directly. It sounded insane. But I circled it, asking oblique questions about the nature of thought and communication, and she listened with her usual professional calm, her notes neat and unhurried, and her rational, grounded responses only made the event seem more monstrous, more alien. The disconnect was terrifying. Here was the source of the words, yet she was completely unaware of their spectral echo in my living room. I started to see patterns everywhere. The way the light hit her glasses sometimes seemed like a signal. The titles of the books on her shelf felt like coded messages. At home, Alex was increasingly on edge, watching me with a nervous intensity, constantly asking if I was okay, if I wanted to talk, his concern now feeling cloying, suffocating. I stopped sleeping, spending hours online, falling down rabbit holes of parapsychology and thought transference, becoming convinced that Dr. Evans was somehow a powerful psychic, that our therapeutic connection had opened a channel she wasn't even aware of, a leak from her mind into mine, mediated by that stupid piece of cardboard. The Ouija board sat on the coffee table, a dark magnet, and a few nights later, driven by a compulsive need for confirmation, I suggested we try again. Alex resisted, more strongly this time, his anxiety palpable. "Mark, this is a bad idea. It's not helping. It's making things worse," he pleaded, but I was insistent. A man possessed by the need to possess an explanation. Any explanation, even a terrifying one. Reluctantly, he agreed, and we took our places again, the candles casting longer, more menacing shadows this time. The planchette moved almost immediately, urgently, and it didn't bother with greetings. It went straight to spelling out phrases that were like ice water down my spine. Patient exhibits subtle signs of dissociation during discussion of career. I had dissociated during our last session, just for a moment, when talking about a missed promotion, drifting out of my body as she spoke, and I had never mentioned it to anyone, not even to Alex. I had barely admitted it to myself. And then the final devastating blow. Primary concern dash, passive suicidal ideation low risk. I recoiled, snatching my hands away, sending the planchette clattering to the floor. Those were not my words. Those were a diagnosis, a clinical assessment, the kind of thing written in private session notes. I stared at Alex, who looked utterly horrified, his face a mask of genuine terror. "How?" I whispered, my whole body trembling. "I never told you that. I never. That's what she writes. That's in her notes." The horror was complete. This wasn't just an echo of things said. This was a breach into a private, confidential space. The entity, this Martin, wasn't a ghost. It was a voyeur, a reader of a therapist's most private thoughts about her patients. My world shrunk to a pinpoint of terror. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through the days in a daze of fear and suspicion. I confronted Dr. Evans, finally, stammering out a fractured account of the Ouija board and the notes, and she listened, her expression shifting from professional concern to a more genuine, profound alarm. But it was the alarm of a psychiatrist faced with a patient experiencing a psychotic break, not someone whose secret had been discovered. She gently suggested we explore these ideas of reference, this delusional thinking, and maybe adjust my medication. And her rational concern was the most frightening thing of all, because it meant she truly didn't know, which meant the phenomenon was real, and I was truly, utterly alone in this nightmare. Alex tried to be my anchor, but the more he tried to pull me back to reality, the more I resented him, convinced he couldn't possibly understand the metaphysical violation I was experiencing. He started sleeping on the couch, and the house became a museum of our broken connection, every room filled with the artifacts of a life that now felt like a lie. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, an utterly ordinary evening that should have been filled with nothing more than the mundane decision of what to watch on television. I was carrying a glass of water to the couch where Alex was working on his laptop, my hand shaking so badly from a combination of sleeplessness and a new, jittery medication that the glass slipped from my grasp, shattering on the floor and splashing water across the coffee table, and catastrophically, across Alex's laptop. He jumped up with a curse, and I immediately started apologizing, grabbing a towel to mop up the mess, my movements frantic, clumsy. He snatched the laptop away, wiping it furiously, his face tight with a panic that seemed disproportionate to the accident. It's fine, just be careful," he snapped, and in his haste to check the machine, he opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, illuminated by the soft glow of the television. And there it was. He hadn't logged out. The browser was open to a single tab. The header was a soft blue, with the familiar logo I'd seen on a pamphlet in Dr. Evans's waiting room. And below the logo, in clear, stark text, was my full name, Mark Hallowell. And below that, the heading, Session Notes, October 15th. My breath caught in my throat. Time slowed to a crawl. My eyes, against my will, scanned the text on the screen. The words were clinical, detached, yet intimately familiar. Patient exhibits subtle signs of dissociation during discussion of career. My gaze dropped lower. Primary concern, passive suicidal ideation, low risk. Continue to monitor. Word for word. The exact phrases that had glided out from under our fingers on the planchette. The supernatural horror that had been haunting me for weeks evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, crushing, mundane truth that was infinitely more violating. The air left my lungs in a quiet whoosh. I looked from the screen to Alex's face, which had gone from panic to ashen, his eyes wide with the horror of being caught. The pieces fell into place with a sickening, brutal clarity. His constant anxiety about my progress, his desperate need to understand, his nervousness around the Ouija board. He hadn't been afraid of a spirit. He'd been afraid of his own secret guiding our hands. You, I whispered, the word barely audible. The violation was so complete, so profound. It felt like my internal organs had been rearranged. My sanctuary, the one place I was supposed to be utterly honest, had been invaded. The trust that formed the foundation of our life together was not just broken, it had been pulverized. The confrontation that followed was a quiet, devastating affair, stripped of the screaming I had always imagined such a betrayal would entail. There were only tears, his mostly, and a torrent of excuses that washed over me without sticking. I was just so worried about you, Mark. I didn't know how to help. I thought if I understood what she was thinking, I could be better for you. The password was easy. It was your birthday. His words were like insects buzzing around my head, meaningless and irritating. The why didn't matter. The act itself was the only truth that remained. He had been reading the intimate, unvarnished assessments of my broken mind, week after week, and then he had sat across from me, holding my hands, his face a mask of loving concern, while his subconscious, saturated with the stolen words of my therapist, guided us both to a revelation designed to shatter me. In the days that followed, a new and more insidious horror took root, a chilling postscript to the betrayal. If the Ouija board was, as it always had been, just a piece of wood and plastic, and the movement was indeed ideomotor, coming from our own unconscious muscles, then what did it mean that it was Alex's unconscious mind, brimming with the stolen contents of Dr. Evans's notes, that had been the driving force? It meant that somewhere deep inside him, beneath the layers of love and concern, was a repository of my most shameful secrets, my most clinical diagnoses, and that this hidden knowledge had found a way to express itself, to act itself out in a grotesque pantomime of spiritual contact. The person I had shared my bed with, my life with, was a stranger who held a blueprint to my fragility, a voyeur who had not only looked into my private world, but had, in a sense, become a conduit for it, his own mind a haunted house built with the bricks of my therapy notes. The line between love and violation was not just crossed, it was erased, and the true terror was no longer that I was haunted by a ghost, but that I was living with a man whose love had curdled into a surveillance so complete, so intimate, that it could speak with the voice of my own therapist, and the most frightening question of all remained, and would always remain, utterly unanswerable. What else did his subconscious know that he hadn't yet, even accidentally, revealed? The silence that filled the house after the revelation was a physical presence, thick and heavy, absorbing all sound until the only thing I could hear was the frantic, hummingbird beat of my own heart, a frantic rhythm against the crushing weight of the truth, and Alex's attempts to bridge the chasm between us with words. Pleas, explanations, tearful justifications that all blurred into a single, monotonous drone of betrayal, were like stones dropped into a bottomless well, producing no echo, no response from the numb void I had become. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my senses heightened yet detached, every object now seeming to hold a hidden meaning, a potential clue to the depth of his deception. The way he always made sure to be the one to check the mail, the times I'd find him scrolling absently on his phone, his face illuminated by the glow, the careful, deliberate way he would phrase questions about my sessions. Did you and Dr. Evans talk about anything new today? Questions I had taken for concern now revealed as a predator's gentle probing, checking the accuracy of his stolen data against my lived experience. He slept on the couch, a permanent arrangement now, and I would lie awake in our bed, in the bed we had shared for a decade, and stare at the ceiling, the memory of his touch now feeling like a violation, a lie written on my skin, and I would try to pinpoint the exact moment it had started, the first time he had typed my name into that portal, the click of the mouse that had opened the door to my innermost self, and I wondered if he felt a thrill, a sense of power, as he read Dr. Evans's cool analysis of my pain, if he saw my tears and my struggles as data points to be cataloged, my healing a project he was managing from the shadows. The Ouija board was gone. I didn't know where he had put it, but its absence was a greater presence than its physical form had ever been, a monument to the horrifying collaboration between us, a seance where we had unknowingly summoned the specter of his betrayal, and the most chilling thought, the one that coiled in my gut like a snake, was the realization that the board had not lied. It had told a truth far more terrible than any ghost story, a truth about the man I loved, about the quiet, meticulous violence of his concern. I couldn't bring myself to see Dr. Evans again. The thought of sitting in that room, of speaking my truth, felt like a further contamination, because how could I ever know if my words were truly mine anymore, or if they were being filtered through the lens of what I now knew she knew, what he had read, the entire therapeutic framework now exposed as a breached system, its confidentiality a joke, its sanctity defiled. I called and canceled my next appointment, citing a stomach bug, my voice surprisingly steady on the phone. And then I let the calls from her office go to voicemail, each one a silent accusation. Alex tried to go back to normal, to the rituals of our life together, making coffee, suggesting we watch a movie, asking if I wanted to order takeout. But every gesture was now a performance, a desperate pantomime of a life that had been hollowed out. And I would watch him, this stranger in my kitchen, and see the calculations behind his eyes, the constant, anxious monitoring of my mood, my state. And I knew he was comparing the real-time data of my despair against the clinical records in his mind. The real horror was not the initial shock, but the slow, grinding aftermath, the way the betrayal metabolized into every facet of my existence, poisoning memories, twisting simple joys into complex wounds. I looked at a photograph of us on a hiking trip, our faces smudged with dirt and smiles, and I wondered if that was before or after he had started reading the notes. If the hand he had around my shoulder in the picture was the same hand that would later guide the planchette to spell out my diagnosis. The question of what to do next was a vast, impossible landscape I couldn't navigate. Leaving felt as unimaginable as staying, because leaving would mean admitting that this had happened, that the foundation of my life was ash, and staying meant living with a permanent low-grade terror. The knowledge that I was sharing my life with someone capable of such a profound and intimate violation, all under the banner of love. We became experts in a new, terrible language of avoidance, speaking only of practicalities, our conversations stripped of all emotion, becoming transactions about groceries and bills, and the house, once a haven, was now a prison of quiet tension, each room a stage for the unspoken tragedy playing out between us. And then one night, about a week after the discovery, I found myself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching him sleep on the couch, his face softened by slumber, looking for a moment like the man I had fallen in love with, and a wave of such profound and complicated sorrow washed over me. Not just for me, but for him, for the twisted path his love had taken, for the desperation that must have driven him to such an act. And in that moment, I understood that the haunting was not over. It had simply changed form. The ghost was no longer in a board or in stolen notes. The ghost was the memory of the trust we had shared, a phantom limb that would ache for the rest of my life. And the chilling, inescapable truth was that the person I missed most, the man I had built a life with, was the same man sleeping on the couch, and he was gone, replaced by this anxious voyeur, and I was left alone in the house with him, with the ghost of us and the terrible, silent knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The days began to bleed into one another, a gray smear of time where the only markers were the slow accumulation of unwashed dishes in the sink and the deepening hollows under Alex's eyes, which mirrored my own, a silent testament to the shared prison we now inhabited, a prison built from the very bricks of my supposed sanctuary. And I found myself engaging in a new, obsessive ritual. I would wait until he left the house, for groceries or, with a pathetic optimism that made me sick for what I suspected were hopeful trips to the pharmacy to buy my favorite ice cream or the kind of bread I liked. And the moment the door clicked shut, I would move through the rooms not as myself, but as a detective, a profiler, searching for other evidence, other violations I had missed. I didn't touch his laptop. The sight of it filled me with a cold nausea, but I looked elsewhere, through the drawers of his bedside table, finding only old receipts and loose change, and through the stack of books on his side of the bed, half hoping and half terrified to find one on psychology or cognitive behavioral therapy. But there was nothing, just the familiar novels and biographies, their normalcy a further insult. I was looking for the blueprint of the stranger I lived with, for some clue that would make his actions comprehensible. But all I found was the mundane debris of our life together, each ordinary object now seeming to mock me with its pre-betrayal innocence. The real horror was in the quiet moments, the times when the sheer absurdity of the situation would crash over me. I'd be standing at the kitchen window, watching a bird peck at the lawn, and the thought would surface, clear and insane. My partner read my therapist's notes, and then used a Ouija board to tell me what was in them. It was a sentence that belonged in a bad novel, not in my life, and the disconnect between the grotesque reality and the placid suburban view outside the window created a cognitive dissonance so violent it made me dizzy. I started having dreams, not of ghosts or demons, but of words, of letters sliding across a page like ants, forming into the clinical phrases from the notes. And I would wake up with a start, the taste of copper in my mouth, and see the faint strip of light under the bedroom door from the living room. A reminder that he was out there, awake too, both of us trapped in the wake of his catastrophic love. He tried again, a week after the silent treatment began, to approach me not with words but with an object. He had dug out an old photo album from a box in the closet, the one from our trip to Italy years ago, and he placed it on the coffee table between us, open to a page where we were both squinting in the sunlight in front of the Colosseum, our arms around each other, young and stupid and happy. He didn't say anything, just pointed at the picture, his finger trembling slightly, and looked at me with eyes full of a desperate, raw plea, and I felt a surge of such pure, undiluted rage that it shocked me. A white-hot fury that this was his defense, this appeal to a past that his actions had irrevocably poisoned. That photograph was no longer a memory. It was an artifact from a dead civilization, and he was asking me to mourn with him, to yearn for a time before he decided that love meant surveillance, that care meant infiltration. I looked from his pleading face to the happy, ignorant faces in the photograph, and I did something I had never done before. I laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound that cracked the fragile silence of the room. The laugh had no humor in it. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt, and I saw him flinch as if I'd struck him, his face crumbling, and he slowly closed the album and retreated back to his post on the couch. And I knew in that moment that whatever fragile thread might have remained had been severed, not by my anger, but by my ridicule, and the house felt even quieter after that, the silence now absolute, final. The question of what to do next became a dull, constant pressure in my skull, a loop with no exit. I could leave, but where would I go, and what would I say? How could I explain to friends, to family, that the relationship had ended because my boyfriend was too caring in the most violating way imaginable? It was an untenable explanation, a story that would make me sound paranoid, unstable, and I realized, with a fresh wave of despair, that he had, in his misguided attempt to help, effectively isolated me, because the truth was too bizarre to speak aloud. Or I could stay, and I began to imagine what that would look like, a future of separate beds and silent meals, a performance of couple-dom for the outside world, while inside we were two ghosts haunting the same space. And the thought was so suffocating that I would have to physically shake my head to dispel it. And through it all, the most persistent, chilling thought was the one about the Ouija board itself, the mechanics of that night. His subconscious mind, so saturated with the stolen words of my therapist, had found a way to speak, to externalize its secret knowledge through the simple, ideomotor phenomenon of the planchette. So what did that mean for the future? What other stolen thoughts, what other secret judgments were lodged in the dark corners of his mind, waiting for another outlet, another way to leak into our life? The violation was not a single event. It was a permanent state of being. He had become a living, breathing repository of my most private self, and every glance, every word he spoke to me, was now filtered through that knowledge. I was no longer just Mark. I was the patient, the case study, the collection of symptoms and diagnoses that he carried with him. And the terrifying realization was that I could never unknow that, and I could never look at him again without seeing the voyeur who had read the blueprint of my broken mind, and then somehow had helped me read it too. The crushing inertia finally broke on a Tuesday morning. Not with a bang, but with the simple, mundane act of the coffee maker failing to turn on. Alex had set it up the night before, part of his desperate, automated routine of penance. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened, no red light, no gurgle, just a dead, silent machine, and I stood there in the dim kitchen light, my hands still on the switch. And I felt something inside me snap, not in anger, but in a clear, cold certainty that I could not spend one more day in this house, with this man, waiting for another appliance to break, for another silent meal to be endured, for another night of lying awake listening to the faint sound of his breathing from the other room. The decision was not a dramatic one. It was a quiet, logistical shift in my brain, a moving from the question of if to the problem of how. I walked out of the kitchen, past the living room where Alex was still asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled over his head, and I went into the bedroom and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the morning stillness. I did not pack a bag with trembling hands. I moved with a methodical, detached efficiency, pulling a small suitcase from the top of the closet, the one we used for weekend trips, and I began to fill it not with memories, but with necessities, with underwear and socks, a few pairs of jeans, some shirts, the simple, neutral components of a life, carefully avoiding any item he had given me, any article of clothing that held the ghost of a shared moment. I could not go to a friend's house. I could not bear the questions, the pitying looks, the need to fabricate a palatable reason for my sudden presence. So I booked a room at a generic chain hotel near the airport, a place designed for transients, for people with no past and no future, a perfect non-place to disappear. I was writing a note, a cold, brief message I planned to leave on the kitchen counter. I need to be alone for a while. Don't contact me. When I heard the couch creak, followed by his footsteps padding towards the bedroom, the door handle turned, but the door was locked, and the silence on the other side was heavier than any knock. "Mark?" His voice was thick with sleep, laced with a familiar, anxious tension. I didn't answer. I just stood there, holding my breath, the note crumpling slightly in my fist. "Mark, please, open the door. We need to talk." The we felt like a violation in itself. There was no we anymore. There was just him, and the person he had turned me into, a paranoid, hollowed-out version of myself. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, and the words hung in the air, final and absolute. There was a long pause, and then a soft thud, as if he had leaned his forehead against the door. "Please don't. Please. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy myself. I'll do anything." It was a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. The word mistake was so inadequate, so insultingly small for the cataclysm he had wrought, that it solidified my resolve. A mistake is spilling milk, not systematically invading the deepest recesses of someone's psyche for months. I zipped up the suitcase, the sound loud and definitive. "It's too late for that," I said, and I meant it. The healing I needed now could not happen within the same walls that held the contamination of his betrayal. I waited until I heard his footsteps retreat, followed by the sound of the sink running in the kitchen, and then I unlocked the door and walked out, suitcase in hand, not looking at him as I moved through the living room towards the front door. He was standing by the counter, his shoulders slumped, his face a mess of tears and stubble, and he looked so broken, so utterly defeated, that for a second a flicker of the old compassion tried to ignite within me, but I smothered it instantly. His pain was no longer my responsibility, it was a consequence, and I would not let myself be manipulated by it. "Where will you go?" he whispered, and I just shook my head, not granting him the knowledge, not giving him another data point to file away. I opened the front door, and the morning air, cool and fresh, hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could take a full breath. I didn't look back as I walked to my car, the wheels of the suitcase clacking on the pavement, a sound of escape, of movement, of life going on. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, watching our house, the house we had picked out together, grow smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared around a corner, and the terrifying, exhilarating truth settled over me. I was free of the haunted house, but I was now alone in the wider world with the ghost he had created. the ghost of a man who no longer knew what was real, who could no longer trust the sanctity of his own mind. And the journey ahead was not towards healing, but towards learning to live with the haunting, to build a new life around the permanent, silent scar of that violation. The hotel room was exactly what I needed: beige, anonymous, smelling of antiseptic cleaner and air conditioning. A space with no history, no memories, no echoes of us. I lay on the stiff bed and stared at the textured ceiling, and the silence was different here. It was my silence, not ours, and in that quiet, the final, most chilling question of all emerged from the depths, the one that would likely haunt me for the rest of my days. If his love could morph into such a meticulous, soul-consuming violation, then what did that say about the nature of love itself? And was there any way to ever trust its shape again?